What if I told you that Ferrari has already made the riskiest decision of the entire 2026 era, and that the other teams discovered it in just 3 days in Bahrain? Because this was not a simple preseason test. It was not an irrelevant timetable. It was the exact moment in which the paddock understood that the SF26 is not a conventional car. It is a bet on the limit of the regulations, the limit of weight, the limit of aerodynamics, and the limit of hybrid management. While some teams were looking for stability and margin for error, Ferrari decided to live on the edge. And as soon as the car hit the track in Sakhir, it became clear. When everything fits, the SF26 is devastating, but when something goes wrong, the balance becomes fragile. Ferrari arrived at the Bahrain test with a very clear external narrative: quiet work, solid internal data, and confidence in the SF26 concept. But what happened on the first day of testing was much more revealing than it seemed. From the first runs, it was noted that the car was not a simple prudent evolution, but rather an extreme interpretation of the new 2026 regulation, something that was already anticipated in the document we analyzed. The SF26 appeared with extremely compact rear packaging, very closed side pods, and a weight reduction philosophy that aimed directly at the regulatory limit. That is not a technical coincidence, it is a strategic statement. During the morning of the first day, Ferrari focused on short runs and aerodynamic evaluations. At first glance, the car showed a very competitive top speed on the long straights of Sakhir. That information began to circulate quickly in the paddock because it did not fit with the expectation of a new car under the 2026 regulations, where many teams were prioritizing stability over pure efficiency. Ferrari, on the other hand, seemed to have designed a car that opted for aggressive aerodynamic efficiency combined with an ambitious electrical deployment. And that is where the magnitude of his decision began to be understood. However, the first indication that this bet had a cost appeared in medium-speed corners. On several long stops, the car showed a twitchy rear end when the hybrid delivery was not perfectly synchronized with the downforce. It was not an uncontrollable car, but it was an extremely sensitive one. That sensitivity revealed something key. Ferrari had not built a car with a wide adjustment window, but one that needs millimeter precision to function at its optimal point. The SF26 does not forgive deviations. As the day progressed, as fuel loads began to vary, it became evident that the car had a very high performance ceiling when everything was aligned. On clean laps, without traffic and with the energy mode correctly calibrated, the car generated figures that caught the attention of rival engineers. But in slightly longer stints, small thermal variations or changes in balance altered the rear behavior. That is to say, the car is fast, but it requires ideal conditions. The truly shocking thing about the first day was not the stopwatch, it was the concept. Ferrari decided to build the SF26 practically at the regulatory weight limit, seeking to maximize every available gram to strategically redistribute mass. This reduces the margin of correction during the season. When you work so close to the minimum, any upgrade or structural reinforcement becomes an engineering puzzle. That is the bet that was exposed in Sakhir. They have prioritized maximum immediate performance over operational robustness. And here is the narrative key to Act 1. The first day in Bahrain did not show a cautious Ferrari, it showed a Ferrari convinced that to dominate 2026 it is not enough to be solid, you have to be radical. The other teams detected it instantly. Because while some were looking for stability, Ferrari was measuring how much they could push the limit without breaking it. This was just the beginning. What happened on the second day confirmed that it was not an isolated test. It was a complete philosophy. If the first day left signs, the second day in Bahrain confirmed the real magnitude of Ferrari's bet. It was no longer about loose turns or basic aerodynamic exploration. The team began to work with more representative runs, more varied fuel loads and simulations that allowed performance to be compared in conditions closer to the race. And that's when the SF26 showed its true personality. Under ideal conditions, the car was extremely competitive. When the hybrid power was perfectly calibrated and the active aerodynamics operated within its optimal window, the Ferrari reached top speed figures that began to bother several rivals in the pit lane. It wasn't just fast in a straight line, it was efficient. The electrical deployment seemed more aggressive than anticipated, and that suggested that Ferrari had decided to optimize energy management to maximize immediate performance, even if that meant greater complexity in the setup. But that aggressiveness had a price. During the longer stints of the second day, clear patterns began to appear. The car became more delicate when the track temperature changed slightly or when degradation altered the natural balance of the car. The rear showed marked sensitivity in medium-speed corners, especially in transition phases between braking and acceleration. This instability was not a structural failure, it was a direct consequence of a concept taken to the limit. And this is where Ferrari's shocking decision is understood. They have designed a car whose performance ceiling is very high, but whose operating window is extremely narrow. It is not a forgiving single-seater. It requires perfect synchronization between electric torque delivery, downforce, and suspension settings. Any slight deviation results in loss of stability. This was already described as a central part of the concept in the previous analysis, but on the track it became tangible. Another element that caught attention on the second day was the extreme packaging in the rear area. By working so close to the weight limit, Ferrari reduced structural and thermal margins. This requires very precise management of internal temperatures and airflow. In long runs, the balance varied slightly as those conditions evolved. It wasn't a collapse, but it was a clear sign that the car needs a very controlled environment to perform at its best. While other teams seem to prioritize stability and ease of setup in this initial phase of the 2026 regulations, Ferrari was testing how far they could push the limit without compromising the package. And the most telling thing is that they did not correct the concept during the day. They adjusted parameters, yes, but they did not soften the philosophy. That means that the decision was not circumstantial, it is structural. The second day in Bahrain did not weaken Ferrari's commitment, it reaffirmed it. The SF26 can be one of the fastest cars of the new cycle if they manage to extend its operating window slightly. But if they fail, every small change in conditions could turn an advantage into vulnerability. The third and final day of testing in Bahrain was the moment when everything clicked. There was no longer room for speculation or excuses for adaptation. The teams began to carry out more representative simulations, cross-comparisons and batches that, although not definitive, did allow real trends to be measured. And in that context, the SF26 completely exposed the magnitude of the decision that Ferrari had made. In the early hours of the day, something very revealing was seen. When the car was operating under controlled conditions with calibrated power and optimized balance, performance was outstanding. Efficiency on the straight was still one of its strong points, and the load generated by the ground and the diffuser worked very effectively in stable support phases. The Ferrari was not only fast, it was technically consistent with his extreme philosophy. The problem was not the potential. The problem was the dependence on precision. As the long runs progressed, the behavior once again showed that sensitivity that had already been hinted at in the previous days. Small changes in temperature, minimal variations in the rate of degradation, or slight adjustments in hybrid delivery altered the overall balance of the car. Not catastrophically, but enough to show that SF26 requires a perfectly aligned environment to perform at its best. It is an all-or-nothing car. And that, in a long calendar and with changing conditions, is a double-edged sword. What became clear after those 3 days is that Ferrari has not built a car thinking about minimizing risks during the start of the 2026 regulations. They have designed a car optimized for absolute maximum performance. They have worked at the limit of the regulatory weight, they have compacted the rear area to the extreme, they have integrated aggressive energy management, and they have opted for aerodynamic solutions that squeeze every millimeter allowed by the regulations. That combination can make the SF26 the benchmark if they manage to stabilize the operational window. But if they fail to widen that margin, any deviation could cost consistency. The third day did not show an unsure Ferrari. It showed a Ferrari aware of the risk it is taking. They didn't back down on the concept, they didn't soften the aggressiveness of the approach, they showed no signs of reconsidering the philosophy. That's the most shocking thing. The decision was not the result of a specific test. It is the structural basis of the project. After Bahrain, the paddock understood something fundamental. Ferrari does not want to survive the beginning of the new technical era. He wants to dominate her from the first moment. And to do so, it has decided to walk along the edge of the regulations, weight and technical complexity. After 3 days in Bahrain, the conclusion is overwhelming. Ferrari has not designed the SF26 to be comfortable, nor forgiving, nor progressive. He has designed it to win, or to fail trying to do it at the highest level. What we saw in Sakhir was not a simple adaptation phase. It was the confirmation of a radical philosophy. A car built to the regulatory weight limit, with extreme packaging, aggressive hybrid management and aerodynamics that work brilliantly when everything is perfectly synchronized. But also a car that punishes any minimal deviation in balance, temperature or energy delivery. Ferrari has made a very clear strategic decision. They prefer a very high performance ceiling even if that implies a narrow operating window. They prefer to live on the edge of the regulations rather than start 2026 with a conservative concept. And that was completely exposed to the rest of the teams in just 3 days. The SF26 has real potential. Nobody disputes that after Bahrain. The speed is there. Efficiency too. But the big question this preseason leaves open is whether Ferrari will be able to extend that operating window enough to turn that potential into consistency. Because in Formula 1, the car that has the most brilliant lap in ideal conditions does not win. The car that can repeat its performance under pressure, under wear, and under changing variables wins. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.